Hello and welcome to what is in effect the genesis story of Tōgō Heihachirō, the victor of the Battle of Tsushima, but also the period of transition where Japan turns into what we understand it to be in World War I and World War II, from the shogunate to that. And also, I'm going to add in this. Yes. This, of course, is what we have going on. The Australia expedition. 2023. So far we have raised quite a lot of money. And let's be honest, it is a lot of money. And that's all thanks to your support. We need to raise more. You can see the target there. We especially need to raise more by over this weekend if we're going to make sure that we can take all four of us, because it's reaching the point at which we have to start working out how we would deal with reduced levels of money, or the money not coming in enough time that it, how do I put it, won't cover the expenses, because the tickets and everything will start to go up in price. I will add that we wanted everything to go right in it. We wanted everything to be correct, so we spent a lot of time working on this site. And I think lessons for the future is that we need to start the advertising and fundraising a lot earlier for these trips. But there again, the fact that you've all been so generous in such a short time, and we've got to 9,000 odd pounds, is frankly amazing. So, thank you. We need to get higher. We do need to get a lot higher. But, thank you. Whatever we manage to do, and there will be, at the very minimum point at this point, we reckon we will probably get at least 3 of us out there. It's the question if we'll get all 4. That's this weekend. That's what the fundraising this weekend is about. It's about getting that 4th person. So, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for your support. So, without much further ado, the Battle of Hakodate. The origin story of Tōgō Heihachirō. Now, this is as much a period of history as it is anything else. It is as much a shameless book plug. Yay! Again, the fundraising for Australia is amazing. The support you do give on this channel through Patreon, through Super Chats, through just watching the videos and seeing the adverts, that's what allows me to do all this history and do all this historical work. And it's things like the book, which money coming in from that, which allow me to be honest, eat. I do like my food. Hey, you know, we're all allowed to have our foibles. I don't drink alcohol, I don't smoke. So, good food, and iron brew. Yeah, for vices they're not particularly bad. The Battle of Hakodate. Well, the whole battle, not just the naval battle, the whole battle lasts from 4th of December 1868 to the 27th of June 1869. And really, it's the final phase of the Boshin War. The Boshin War is... well, how do I put this? We have a reforming shogun who has come to power after a previous shogun who was kind of weak has died. And a young emperor who has come to power after a long-term and running emperor has died. And the 29-year-old shogun is trying to reform and improve Japan and bring it and modernize it so it can no longer be subject to the whims and wills of the rest of the world. Then, under as part of this sort of reformation, he's of course having to let Westerners and other influences in to try and modernize so they can be strong enough to keep those Westerners out from doing to them what happened to India and what he sees happening to China. However, under the banner of restoring the power of the emperor away from the shogun, other lords, another group, will get together, will seize control of the emperor, and then using imperial banners as their cover, will force out the shogun, and then force out the supporters of the shogun, etc., the other factions, to take over. Using, as part of that they will keep the Westerners out. Then they will go on a tour of the West. And by the way, when they're forcing the Westerners out, they were using weapons which were mostly supplied to them by the Westerners. And the thing is, you have to remember, the shogun was building up his strength, but was doing that and using a lot of advice and a lot of support from France. The powers that were coming to seize the emperor, etc., were supported by Britain. With America alternating between both sides depending on what they were feeling like. And then what happens afterwards is some of those leaders that are forced go on a tour of the West and see the great capabilities of the West, and they come back, and the most important leader, who had been militarily, who had commanded the armies, who had been linked most to the cause of restoring the power of the emperor and putting the power in the emperor and doing what they really claim to do, ends up being forced out of power, leading a rebellion against them, and then dying theoretically by honourable suicide in a battle which, if he'd lived, possibly his forces would have won. Theoretically, his forces were going to lose, but possibly his forces were going to win. And yeah, this is what we're dealing with this period. And then, of course, Japan did pursue a very Western-orientated relationship. They got closer and closer with Britain, eventually coming the Anglo-Japanese Naval Treaty and the Anglo-Japanese Alliance and all those things. And yeah, the life got beautiful and very close to the West. And the emperor, of course, went from having, well, no power with a shogun ruling, who was a relative who occasionally listened to him, to having people who would prophesize and talk to everyone about how powerful and how divine the emperor was and how important they were, and were even less inclined to listen to them, and were even more the puppets of the very powerful and rich nobles. So yes, what are the long-term causes of the Boshin War? Well, there's the unequal treaties, the various agreements with various powers who've forced their way into Japan, and they are unequal treaties because they are, in the nicest way, negotiated, if not quite at the point of the sword, then definitely with the knowledge that there are large ships with lots of cannon on them sitting in your harbour. And in fact, their dates and their accords of their work does accord with the visitations of such large ships. Unequal treaties is a phraseology which Morrison used to describe the treaties with China, but can fit these ones for Japan, it can fit the ones with Korea, and well, Japan mainly forced those on Korea and various other nations that went on at the time. Unequal treaties are honestly the way they did business at this point. There is that very, 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 very convoluted saying in terms of its historiography, in that there are many people who claim to be the source, and many people who claim that, no, the real source is more recent or older, that the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. I'd say there have been variations around that for a long time. And it is often used to disparage realpolitik and but it isn't. Basically, the phrasing should be this: never make yourself so weak that you so weak and abase yourself so much that you cannot be a threat. And this is really the point which Japan learns in this period, and why Japan starts to differ quite so greatly, because Japan very quickly does modernize, okay? they very quickly do start to buy and procure stuff, especially from the Dutch, who they've long had a relationship with. And pretty much they're buying, what they're buying from the Dutch and what they're buying from everyone else are warships. Because they know, as long as they are weak navally and they have ships which can't match up with these leviathans in comparison to their own vessels in terms of firepower, they can't do anything. And one of the interesting problems for the shogunate is that they are both, because of the way the structure of Japan is structured, they don't have an Imperial Japanese army, don't have an Imperial Japanese navy at the time of these treaties. They depend on each of the daimyos, it's a sort of feudal system, to have that maintain their own military forces. And the shogun has to maintain the strongest force. And the shogun has to build a military force not just to defend their own territories in Japan, but also to act as the external defense. Now, for this, they have money and support, and they're able to claim all sorts of things from the other powers within Japan, but this means that they are fighting always a two-front war, especially in procurement terms. Because the forces you need to maintain law and order within Japan are different from the forces you need to maintain external law and order. In fact, you can argue really that the big problem for Japan is they don't have an imperial army and navy in the 1850s. That they've gone through this period of isolation, and their system, which worked very well, they haven't developed this level of centralized military force. And if they had, you do wonder, well, A, there's a problem doing it under the shogun, because theoretically the shogun acts in the name of the emperor, but the emperor might not be keen on what the shogun's doing, but they don't really get much choice. Now, the bombardment of Kagoshima is a good example of what can happen with the unequal treaties. There is a line within the treaties, and pretty much all of them, which means that the foreigners do not have to respect local laws and customs. And one of the local laws and customs is rather reminiscent of a law in the UK. In the UK, when someone shouts make way for, nowadays, the King's Guard in the Tower of London or various other places, you get out the way, or they will literally walk over you. They walked that line, and they have done for several hundred years, and they aren't changing. Now, today, there's always someone, almost every year, there's some tourist complaining that they didn't stop to take photos, and they were standing in front of them, and why did they walk straight through them? Well, that's because that's their route. But in this period in Japan, they have a similar system whereby daimyo, the lords, and especially their regents, for if they're young people, them and their guard are pretty much the same when they're moving around. When they're moving on the roads, everyone gets out their way. They get to go charging through. They take precedent. You can guess what I'm going to say. Some British merchants in Japan, and one gentleman sort of playing tourist on his retirement, gets killed because he doesn't get out the way, and their rights on the law is if you block them, they can kill you. And then there's a dispute over the law or not, sort of who has precedent. And basically, not only do the British get £100,000 out of the shogun Banfu government of Japan, which is a third of their yearly income. So it's a massive loss to their revenue. But they also go and bombard the Satsuma area of Japan to make their point, and to try and get money out of the local clan and the daimyo, whose regent it was, whose guards killed the merchant. During the defense, Tōgō Heihachirō was actually in charge and gun lieutenant of one of the cannons used to defend the port. And it's a rather embarrassing saga, I have to say, the entire defence, because the Admiral turns up and he hasn't prepared for an actual engagement or actual fight in any way, shape or form. They run out of ammunition. It takes them 2 hours to prepare for combat because everything's so battened down. I mean, it's just... basically, everything that can go wrong with that Admiral's dispositions do go wrong. But, saying all this... the interesting legacy of it is actually leads to not only a demonstration of the weakness of the shogun at that time, because this is the older shogun, not the young one I spoke about again at the beginning, but who is called Tokugawa Yoshihiro, who is the one who takes over and is 29 and then resigns as shogun to try and preserve peace. Sadly, it doesn't work, but, you know, it's a nice idea. What happens in terms of this relationship, this bombardment, this freedom of action, no one's going to exist to stop it. At one point, they were talking about the shogun sending a ship with this force. This is Tokugawa Yoshihiro. But they didn't. They didn't, because probably they realised that actually might start a war internally. But they're also not stopping them. They can't do anything about the British doing this, and this undermines the shogun in every level. They've both lost all that money, they've just shown they're weak in front of in front of the foreign powers, and they're weak in front of the locals because they don't even do the bombardment themselves. And then, to top it all off, the negotiations between the British and the Satsuma clan leads to the British liking the Satsuma clan, and the Satsuma clan liking the British, and then buying a whole load of warships off the British. And becoming pretty much the most Anglophone proxies for the later Boshin War. How to make friends and influence them. Bombard them. Anyway. Short-term causes of the Boshin War are that those powers had been getting more and more powerful. And suddenly you have a shogun, not the old, doddering, who had not really strong, slightly weak man who'd been in power for the previous 20-odd years. But this young man, 29 years old, 28, 29 years old, who had previously been their best general for the shogun. Right. He had literally wiped out a fair number of the opposition to it. He was modernizing, he was developing, but the trouble is, he decides he wants to modernize his army first before his navy. Who does he turn to? France. That upsets the British minister. The British minister, therefore, starts going, we need to get rid of the shogun. We can't afford France to get too much power. Napoleon III is playing too many games. We don't want him to get too much power in Japan. So they start supporting the southern powers. And then when he turns around to the Royal Navy and wants ships, and Britain for ships, Britain's not prepared to give him ships. Because by that point, he's considered francophone. And you can understand why he went for the French army. Let's be honest, in terms of armed forces, the French army is pretty darn good to look at this period. In 1866, you've got a choice of the French army or the American army, and the American army is kind of busy. The British army would claim that they should be looked at. They did send their own military, mission, but the British army has never had that great a reputation. Which is strange, because they are actually very effective, and they are, if you look historically, they've been a pretty darn successful army. But the thing is, the British army is never Britain's first tool. Because, especially in this period, it's an island nation, it's a global maritime empire, maritime trading empire. The Navy's what people see around the world. So when people think army, they don't think Britain, they think France, they think America, they think Prussia. All those things, they don't think Britain. Which is a real strain, because you think about it, the British do some really amazing things as an army. The Peninsula Campaign, a lot of conquest around the world. The British Army fought hard. They fought in a lot of wars. Yeah, they don't have Napoleon as their propagandist owner-in-chief, but they had Wellington, who won Waterloo, with quite a lot of help from Blucher and some timing, and the fact that that Napoleon was really, really not up to his normal best. But even if Napoleon hadn't been up to his best, the land which he allowed Wellington to choose was absolutely absurd. And maybe if he had been his best, he wouldn't have allowed Wellington to choose the land. Because Waterloo is not a good place to fight the kind of battle that they were going to fight. If anything, Napoleon should have skipped past Wellington and kept on going. Forced Wellington to turn his flank or reposition himself. It would have been a sensible scenario. But that's off the topic. They had been getting away, the Southern powers had been growing more powerful, and then they see this man become leader. He becomes shogun. And suddenly they need to react. Because it was feared he was the coming again of the first shogun. And the Japan he would have created would have been very different. Now, you also in this period have, theoretically, the creation of the first Imperial Japanese Navy. Because that's the thing they do, to really cloak themselves. And to make it harder. And this is why Yoshinobu doesn't want to fight them, because they are wearing the imperial standards. They're not claiming to be the armies of the clans, which they actually are. They're not claiming to be the navies of the clans, which they actually are. The daimyo they actually are. They call themselves the Imperial Japanese Navy. They wear the standards of the emperor. And fighting the emperor is... you don't do that. Interestingly enough, though, it doesn't really become an Imperial Japanese Navy rather than a collection of clan vessels cloaked in their flag until Katsu Yasuoshi, or Katsu Kaishu, becomes Minister of the Navy. And he is a former Tokugawa officer and general. He's actually commander of their army at one point and senior officer in their navy. He turns the Imperial Japanese Navy into an Imperial Japanese Navy. Which does give you an interesting idea of what would have happened if his first reforms had, instead of been getting in the military people to come train people and training up the shogunate's forces, the Tokugawa forces, if he'd made a decision to form his forces into the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army. If he'd done that and posted guards on Kyoto, protecting the emperor, we might not have had the Boshin War, and we might have had a very different Japan to deal with in World War I and World War II. That's an interesting thing to consider. So one of the things he does organise is he does all look around and go, right then, we need an ironclad, because he's looking at all the decisions taking place around the world, and he goes, if we have an ironclad, they can't do anything to us. If we have that level of capability, they can't do anything to us. We need firepower. We need an armoured ship that can sail around Japan, because the only way then someone can do something to us is they're going to have to bring HMS Warrior along. And let's be honest, if you're Britain or Japan, and you're Britain or France or any of the major powers, and you're deploying ships to deal with Japan, and you're going to have to send an ironclad out to fight their single ironclad, if you're sending such a force, well, how do I put this politely? If you send out one ship, and it doesn't win, you have a problem. So you need to send out at least 2 ships. Sending out 2 ships, you're still going to have to fight. And that's going to dent your power. So when you're in a scenario where you've got to send out enough ships to win a battle without fighting a battle, to preserve your power and status in the world as the preeminent power, or as a major preeminent power, a major power, then how many do you have to send out to overrule this vessel? It's the risk fleet theory, but in a way which works. You see, the reason the risk fleet theory didn't work was because it was based around a numerical matchup. This one isn't really a technological matchup, but it is for this period, because most of the ships, most of the cruisers on duty wandering around the world, most of these sloops, these corvettes, these frigates, are unarmoured. Most of them are wandering around the world being presence vessels with big, powerful weapons on them and no armour. So you have the same big, powerful weapons and armour, you suddenly are a trump card versus them. And so if I need to fight you, and if I need to overrule you, I need to send out quite a large group. Because the moment I have to engage in a fight with you, I have to win handily. So I'm talking about sending 4 or 5 ships, maybe even 6. A squadron of ironclads, to make sure I not only win handily, but I win in such a way no one notices any damage. Or, alternatively, I have to send double that number. So I turn up with so many ships that I completely overraw you and I don't have to fight. But then also, I have just had to deploy, well, 12 of my most powerful vessels to the other side of the world, if I'm Britain or France, to win an argument with a minor power. Doesn't do much for my status, does it? It really doesn't. You see, for Japan, there was only ever really one major threat to it. The one power which didn't have that status to protect at this point. America. Because America, as powerful as it becomes later, at this point is not perceived as a major power, so do not carry the burden of being a major power. They might think themselves a major power, but they're not. Now, this war is able to be divided into 3 phases. There is the first phase, which is Toba, Koshu, and Edo, which is against the Banfu government, the rump Banfu government after pretty much the resignation of Tokugawa Yoshiribo, who he basically resigns as shogun based on the agreement being pushed by another daimyo, who's not part of this faction, but part of the other faction, to try and reach a compromise, to call a council of daimyo on all the leaders. They're not willing to wait for that, because the council of daimyo might not go the way they want. Remember, they're quite hard line, as officially. Officially, they are very anti-Western, anti-anyone else being involved, while using a lot of Western weapons, and very much restore the emperor to their full power, as long as we're the ones who are his chief ministers. So we're the ones who will be interpreting that full power. And then we have this section, which is sort of the War of the Northern Coalition, who are a group of people who are different daimyos who basically go, no, we're a different faction, clan, we're a different power base, we don't like any of you, we want to fight, we want to resist you, we have quite a large army, we're going to fight you. And then you have Hakodate, which is really the war against the Izo Republic, which is the rump of the Banku forces, and others who have moved up to Hokkaido, the Northern Island, and are basically set themselves up there. It's 1868 to 1869. And the big thing is, this vessel is a major part of it, because she's bought and paid for by the Tokugawa shogunate, who buy her for the Tokugawa shogunate. But the American government decide to deliver her to the Japanese Imperial Navy, which are really the Chosu, Tosa, and Satsuma clans. Mostly the Satsuma, who of course are who Tōgō Heihachirō comes from. Now, in the last phase, leading up to the Battle of Hakodate, there is quite an interesting battle. The Ezo Republic forces, especially the Japanese commanders, but it's often credit is given to their French military advisors, who really do try and take the credit for everything good and blame everything on the Japanese. I'm never quite that keen on that one. In my experience, military advisors claiming that they are everything important in a command and everything good comes from them, and things only go wrong when they're not listened to, is usually just good marketing, or rather attempts at good marketing. It doesn't make sense once you start to think about it. Sorry. My case has started to deconstruct itself. The Battle of Miyako Bay is when the Imperial Japanese Navy is moving north towards Hokkaido, and the Ezo Republic forces, including their flagship, come south. And they come south with the intention of trying to, by surprise, board and take the Koetsu, that ironclad. Because if you take the ironclad, you've won this battle. There is nothing that can really match her. You take her, you can hold off. How long can you hold them off for? Well, I would love to say indefinitely, but not indefinitely. But what you could do, considering the coal supplies and other things in Hokkaido, you could, and I see the Ezo Republic as a good example of this, you could hold off long enough to have a negotiated end. Now, what I mean by negotiated end? Well, if they can no longer win quickly, rather than seeing Japan divided, you can then have a diplomatic agreement come in. And probably you would end up with a federated version of Imperial Japan, with an Imperial Japanese Navy, an Imperial Japanese Army, of some kind, but probably the islands divided into, well, I think you might end up with a northern area, a southern area, and Hokkaido as sort of three sort of areas, each with their own sort of national guards or something. Something so that they could claim they got rid of the Daimyo troops, but in reality the Daimyos do have their own troops, they're the National Guards. And that might actually mean instead of the Imperial Japanese Army. And then the Imperial Japanese Navy is the fleet that protects it all. That could have been an interesting organization, with maybe an Imperial Japanese Army being the forces which deploy around the go abroad. So whenever they're deploying abroad, they're called the Imperial Japanese Army. But what am I basing this in? I'm basing this in some of the analysis of some of what has been translated of historians' work on this period. But the Boshin War gets, because of the Satsuma Rebellion and various things that come after and how bloody they are, this one tends to get all sorts of things written about it being sort of a friendly, nice war, and really it's just as bitter and hard fighting as there are others. It really is. Anyway, Battle of Miyako Bay. 3 ships are dispatched, of which only 1 gets there in time. The vessel that gets there in time is the Kaiten Maru, the flagship of the Ezo force. It comes in flying an American flag to get close. At the last moment it drops its flag, the American flag, and puts up the Ezo Republic flag and rams the Koetsu and then tries to board her. Now, they do all this. The boarding action fails because they board prow on, because they choose to ram the ship. They're trying to cut that, and there's a 3 meter height difference between the height of the Kaiten and the Kotsu at that position, because if you look at it, the ship is quite cut down in the centre. Well, they ram it amidships. Yeah. It makes sense to ram it amidships, but that means you can't really board. And so they're trying to board almost one at a time. They have some initial success, but then very quickly get beaten up once someone turns a Gatling gun on the position and just goes, yeah, we're going to turn that position into beaten lead. Doesn't really work. They then manage to withdraw and escape. They take losses, but they withdraw and escape. And the other 2 ships which have been sent, one had already returned to Hokkaido, and the other one was just arriving in port as they were running away, or withdrawing, with casualties. And it'd been so late because it had got engine damage. So, it doesn't get away. So that's the loss. That is the loss of the operation. But it was an interesting attempt, and if it had succeeded, as said, I can see it becoming a negotiated end rather than what we get. This, of course, is the Kaiten Maro, which was formerly the SMS Danzig, which was sold by the Prussian Navy because it had dry rot in its wooden hull, and then sold on. Doesn't have quite the same lovely story of being sold, and sold again as the Kotsu, or formerly CSS Stonewall, which was built in France with the tacit permission of Emperor Napoleon III. Then when it came out publicly, after they'd taken the money from the Confederates, they then sold it to the Danish, who didn't actually pay for it, but managed to take delivery of it, and then they sold it to the Confederates, who then sold it to the Spanish in Cuba, who sold it to the Americans, who essentially sold it to the Japanese. It never got used in the American Civil War, other than sailing across the Atlantic as the war was ending. Which leads us all to the naval battle of Hakodate, which is rather an ongoing series of battles. It's lots of little battles, because the Imperial Japanese Navy stays as a solid squadron. They stay together. They don't really split up, and they don't do a split up because they know if they do, that can be problems, because some of the individual ships of the Izo Navy are actually stronger than they are. And so, staying as a group, they just slowly wear down and sledgehammer the Izo Navy and slowly beat it off and destroy it, allowing amphibious operations, troop landings, maneuvers to take place, slowly tightening a noose on the Goryoka in Hakodate. It's one of the interesting things. It really shows the amount of money being spent by the Tokugawa in the years leading up to the end of the shogunate to try and strengthen Japan and build up its defences. To try and allow them to be strong enough that they couldn't face the damage which they saw being met out across the world on other nations. It is an interesting thing. It was built to defend Tsuragara Strait from possible invasion by the Russian fleet. And basically, it was meant to buy time. All these fortifications are meant to buy time. You have the artillery, you have all the infantry in them, the troops in them. But basically, it means the enemy are going to have to siege it down. Even if they bring high explosive and all those other things, that is still a very strong, very powerful fortification with a strong garrison in it. it's not going to be something you can easily, quickly sweep over. So you're going to have to fight it. And while you're fighting it, that will give time for the Japanese to organise. And that's all the shogun's plan of defence. Wait for the enemy to attack, and then organise all the forces you can into an central force, and charge. Preferably shogun or similar allied powerful daimyo at the head. The problem with that system, and this is ultimately why the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army are only formed when the Satsuma, Chosun and Tosa are basically seeking a cover for what they're going to do, is that you need to rely on a unified approach to the opponents turning up. A unified reaction. That wasn't always possible. That didn't always happen. So here is Tōgō Heihachirō. This is him as he was at the Battle of Hakodate, where he was third officer aboard this vessel, the Kasuga Maru, the Vernal Sun. This is where he learns his naval career for Satsuma, not for the Imperial Japanese Navy. He is in the Imperial Japanese Navy from the point at which it's really the Satsuma clan with different flags, to the point at which it is formed into a truly national force. And this is why, whilst this is his genesis story, his origin story as the super admiral he becomes, as the great leader, what a Japanese war leader he becomes, it is also in many ways not the story of the Japanese Navy. If you look at the Imperial Japanese Navy, they skip over, honestly, the first 37 years in their histories. The Battle of Tsushima is their foundation myth. There's nothing wrong with that, please note. The Royal Navy does the same to an extent with Trafalgar sometimes. You would be not surprised to know that the two of the major nights which are celebrated every year, Trafalgar Night, Taranto Night. I know because I love those nights. I quite often get invited to very nice places for dinner, as long as on the requirement that I give a speech about those battles. I have never knowingly said no to a good dinner, and I have never knowingly said no to giving a good talk about those battles. They are both wonderful battles to talk about. But that isn't their whole value. Their whole value is also, to an extent, as foundation myths for the modern Royal Navy versus the Age of Sail Royal Navy. And it's the same with Tsushima and Tōgō Heihachirō, because he comes from this era, this period of development and evolution and growth. And the Battle of Tsushima is when they are of age. They are not just fighting off a foreign power. They are beating them. They are dominating them. It's that point at which you can say we have moved from defending ourselves to being able to defend ourselves. And that's important. That's important for Japanese national identity. That's important for Japanese spiritual identity and their internal feelings of strength. And it's one of the interesting things. You get into discussions about all sorts of alternative histories when you're a historian like I, who does public history. And one of the things you often have to explain and get off people, explaining to people is, some of our identity today is not the same as our identity was perhaps back in that period. And some of the things we view today is not the same as we view then. For example, and the only time it was sort of considered at the Washington Naval Treaty was when someone might have suggested, well, what about Britain getting rid of Hood as a way to deal with Hood? It was understood very quickly that Britain would no longer be at the Washington Naval Treaty. If you asked Britain to get rid of its most powerful warship, as it was considered at the time, it was not going to be anywhere near that, because the naval forces were such a big part of Britain, not only security but also national identity still at that time. And it's to an extent the same with Japan. One of the big misunderstandings at the Washington Naval Conference, with the Americans pushing for Japan to have the bare minimum they would accept, is they misunderstand the cultural significance of having the fleet and capability to defend themselves. And they also misunderstand the history of the unequal treaties. To an extent, they sort of still see Japan as... alternatively, they seem to see Japan as still this power they can dictate minor treaties to. And at the same point, they see them as this great big threat. And you sit there and go, you can't have it both ways. You either have to treat them as something approaching an equal, and understand how far they've come since those unequal treaties, since Commodore Perry forced his way in. And by the way, if you're worried that Japan seems to have a not nice opinion of you and your values in the world, well, it could well be because of what you did to them. It's not that long ago. In the nicest way, it's really not that long ago. We go back right to this point of the unequal treaties. It's 1854 Convention of Kanagawa. And that's what? 66 years before the Washington Naval Treaty? There's not just a lot of people alive, there is a whole host of people alive who remember that. There are people who were fully formed adults involved in the government at the time who were still alive in 1920, let alone their children. That means there is a memory. There is an understanding going on there, and that's going to impact their approach to the treaties. So about Hakodate, well, the Boshin War is remembered as this sort of beautiful war because of the early bit of Yoshiburo conceding, because he didn't want to fight the Imperial Japanese. He didn't want to fight people carrying the Imperial banners. But it also has a long-term impact on the way Japan is created, because you always have to remember that the alliance that created this modern Japan was an alliance of convenience. They are brought together by a fear of the power of a young shogun and what he might do to Japan, what he might create, and the supportings of external factors who wished to support him, because if they did, well, they wished to bring him down because they saw him as a threat to their own interests within Japan. Might make Japan more cozy with another power rather than them, which could shore up the French position in the Far East. There again, it could also led to eventually France having to pick between Russia and Japan as an ally in the Russo-Japanese War. Which could have been interesting considering French security policy vis-a-vis Germany at that point. It's all wheels within wheels. But realistically, you have an honest possibility going through this all of how Japan might have turned out. Because as it becomes, the Satsuma clan pretty much gets the navy. And the Chosun clan pretty much gets the army, to an extent. And those clans become dominant, and their rivalry with each other becomes dominant, and you end up with this history, this rivalry between the army, the navy, and a constant rivalry in Japanese politics, because it isn't an evolution of power. It's a courtly faction seizing power, using the cloak of imperial restoration to do so, and then setting up further, I don't know, facades to hide their power and influence, hide their status and capabilities. But that is what we end up with. We don't end up with a unified state being led by a single shogun slash prime minister, whatever they call themselves by that point, forming a unified country. And it's the whole thing you can place down to who sees this as the imperial standards first. Literally decides the fate of a nation. And this is the Kosugomaru, which Tōgō Heihachirō, as third officer, served on during the Boshin War. It doesn't really look like a powerful warship, does it? And it's not really, but it's where he gets his experience, where he starts off studying studying naval war, not just how to fire a cannon, but how to actually operate at sea and how to deal with engines. It's where the seeds of his future career are all laid. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. I found it interesting. The live got into many topics and a lot of detail. I've kept this recording shorter because I'm doing so many recordings today and because tomorrow is the 6th of May. And on the 6th of May is coronation of Prince Charles. Well, technically King Charles at this easiest moment, but he's not been coronated yet, so his official coronation is tomorrow. When he is, from that point, there is no dispute, he is King Charles III. And that will be interesting because Caroline reigns have traditionally been interesting periods of Britain. The first one led to a civil war. The second one led to probably one of the greatest periods of economic growth we ever went through. And an era of science and discovery. Be interesting to see what happens in the third one. I'll probably be able to tell you in about 90 years' time. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care, and again, thank you for your support with Australia. We couldn't be achieving any of this, and we've got so much we want to achieve without your support. Let's check if anything's come in while I've been recording. I think something has. I'm not sure. Thank you, everyone. Take care, and thank you. Bye. Oh, almost forgot question. And I do have an interesting question for you all. Sort of fits with what's coming up. Now, the question that we should be sort of considering is, Japan historically makes friends with the Dutch and sees the whole world through the Dutch, tries to see the world through what the Dutch are telling them without allowing anyone else in but the Dutch. And that's thanks to the Dutch East Indies traders and their policies of various things. What I would like you to think about is change that around. Instead of making it the Dutch, or rather, yeah, let's keep it as the Dutch. But let's say the Dutch pass on a lot more information to the Japanese about what's going outside in the world. They give them a lot more information. And as a result, the shoguns strengthen themselves. They form an Imperial Japanese Navy and Army before the 1850s. And they have a force and a capability. As much as they can build it internally, but with some Dutch technological assistance and some equipment set up and various arsenals, etc. created. How do you think this period plays out? Do you think they managed to maintain their isolation? Do the unequal treaties get negotiated the way they do? If the Japanese have access to ships which are not that dissimilar or that much less powerful than Commodore Perry's squadron, do the Americans send a larger, more powerful squadron than Perry can muster? Be really interested to hear what you think. Thank you very much for watching. Take care and enjoy. Well, have a fun evening.